Hi, everyone. This is week 3, Constructing Social Problems. This is Professor Lovell. Let's get started. So, as you might remember from the chapter, there is a process from turning something into a social problem. And I'm going to say something because uh, it's not just that there's a negative thing, um, because it might be nothing at all. But let's say we have identified something as a problem. First, it needs to be widespread. And second, it needs to be perceived as a social problem. And so the establishment of a problem as a widespread problem is what we've called the objective element. And the turning a widespread problem into a social problem is the subjective element. So the objective element is any condition or behavior that has negative consequences for large numbers of people, while the subjective element is the perception that something or a behavior needs to be addressed. So the objective element is there is literally and in reality a negative consequence for large numbers of people, whereas the subjective element is a perception or an idea that something needs to be addressed and is a negative consequence for large numbers of people. Now, how do people construct problems as social problems? So how do you make it so that people perceive or believe that there is a conduct or behavior that needs to be addressed by society? The text identifies 3 processes. First, claims making. Second, getting legitimacy. And third, reviewing and renewing claims making. So claims makers are anything that is pushing a narrative about a social problem. So this could be protesters, this could be individuals like CEOs, politicians, celebrities, anyone with large influence. It could be trusted groups or experts, or moral groups like nonprofits, churches. It could be the news. And what they need to do, and these claims issues come from the Lippert reading, they need to define the problem, provide examples of the problem, and numerical estimates to how much the problem is happening. And then we're going to skip the assumptions or warrants. You don't need to necessarily know this, but the warrants are connecting it to societal beliefs that other people already hold. And that will make sense as we talk a little bit about the Satanic Panic, but don't worry too much about that. It gets really into the weeds. But so first they need to define the problem, give examples, show a numerical estimate. This thing affects 19% of the population. And then they need to give your conclusions for what to do now that you agree that this thing is a problem. So this can be either awareness or prevention or some kind of policies like laws, and so forth. So let's give an example. COVID. So COVID had a number of constructions of social problems. And in fact, as a class, we're going to show those and research those. I think it's week 11. But later on in the course. But we can think of a number of different claims makers that were trying to define a problem about COVID in different ways. So you had protesters, for example, people who are anti-mask protesters. You had politicians who were either pushing for or against various policies. You had scientists pushing, defining the problem as this is a epidemic or a pandemic, and that's the problem, is that this is going to spread and it's going to kill many people. You had moral groups, depending on their beliefs, pushing different definitions of the problem. Some people saying we need to enact social control. Some people saying this is overreach of the government. Some people saying it doesn't matter, but what you need to do is protect people in poverty and homeless folks, right? So there are all these different ways of defining the problem. So when we look at COVID itself as a social problem, I would say there were 2 main camps that we saw in the US. grow out of this. There were those who believed that it was a public health problem that needed um, drastic measures of masking, of social distancing, of closing mass gatherings. And then there were people who saw it as a government overreach problem. Those were people who felt that the government shouldn't be making decisions about your body, shouldn't be restricting your ability to congregate or get together with other people. And depending on what group you were in, you might provide different examples, right? So, or estimates. People who argued that COVID was an epidemiological problem were showing the statistics of, over 1 million people so far have gotten COVID. I can't remember what the most recent death estimates are in the US. It must be more, I think it's 1 million deaths, um, and a lot more infected. But regardless. And then a lot of, for example, nurses were showing pictures of themselves wearing PPE for 12-hour shifts and what that was doing to their face and how stressful it was to be overwhelmed. Whereas on the other side, you had people who are defining the problem as government overreach, um, providing some interesting estimates. I'm not of like children who were having problems, recognizing faces. So these were mostly not estimates, more the examples in anecdotal. However, they were trying to provide evidence for the problem, and both of them had different conclusions and goals, right? If epidemiology is the problem, then you need those solutions. You need to have prevention policies. You could arrest people who were not following, um, like closing the restaurants or congregating or wearing masks inside. Where on the other side, the conclusions were you needed to shut down government, you needed to resist government intervention, we had people who tried to or to kidnap the governor of Michigan, right? So those were their conclusions and goals. So, as an example, I'm having you read or listen to a couple of texts that talk about the Satanic Panic. And so let's get into that. And before there's any possible confusion, I want to explain that there was not a widespread satanic cult. This was something that happened in the 1980s, largely in the US. It extended before and after the 80s, depending on which area of the country you were in, or if you were in like Canada or the UK. This is an example of what happened in Canada, that there was a small town of Martinsville where more than a dozen people were formally charged as members of a satanic cult that locked children in cages and forced them to witness murders. Now, there wasn't any proof to back this up. No photos, no Satanists, no forensic evidence, despite the claims of thousands of human sacrifices. Um, and it became um, an example of this global, what this piece is saying, insanity, but just really moral panic about the idea of these widespread satanic cults stealing children and abusing them. And this started largely by a book called Michelle Remembers. Michelle Remembers, or Michelle Smith, was a patient who was generally had a decent life, but was still depressed and was going to a psychiatrist, Lawrence Pasder, who was helping her, figure out why she was still depressed or anxious or whatever it was. And he started doing various hypnosis or other events where she believed she was recalling satanic ritual abuse as a child, and that abuse was affecting her adult life. Um, yeah. Just FYI, people have gone back and investigated her recollections, and it seems that most of these events that she recalls couldn't have happened based on um, other corroborations by witnesses and other things that were in different places at the time she said they were there or not. And so it's highly, highly unlikely that these happened. And what has followed after this was a panic across the Western world that people were stealing children or kidnapping children and abusing them or making them watch murders or other things. Almost it really happened a lot to parents and daycare providers who were or daycare providers and teachers who are often accused of this, of leading their children down through secret tunnels into satanic chapels and things like that. um, but there was no actual evidence anywhere that this was actually that this actually A happened, and B that they were Satanists. So how did it happen? How was the entire United States, Canada, the UK, and more worried about this satanic panic? Lippert uses the framework of constructing social problems and identifies a lot of claims makers. He specifically seven or eight. Um, the police were often going in and telling parents that there was Satanists who would get the parents worked up. Child welfare advocates, the news media was reporting this without necessarily fact checking. There were a growth of professionals who were saying they were professionals in satanic cults. Um, some people would come out and say, I was a former Satanist. A lot of those people were debunked and said, like, no, they were just making things up. Christian church leaders were really excited about the idea to recruit more members by threatening this idea of Satanists, and we need to really, bring people back to the church to fight this big problem. And the claims that they made had a lot of problems. Remember, for the specific claims, you need definitions, examples, and estimates. The definitions often used in constructing Satanism were vague, and they really included everything. There is a video out you can find on YouTube, a training video to teach police officers how to recognize Satanism. And it pretty much addresses any problem or any crime that you've ever heard of. They were like, you might have Satanists if there's heavy smoking, underage drinking, homosexuality, like cross-dressing. And they just list all of these, marijuana, cocaine, So anything that was concerning to the cops, they threw into this, then you might have Satanists. The biggest draw was the examples, because a lot of these, the claims that people said I was kidnapped as a child, or like Michelle remembers, gave really graphic ideas of what happened. And Michelle remembers she talks about watching a baby get murdered while she was a kid, and goes into pretty graphic detail. And so that's largely what was spurring on people's concerns, was how graphic the examples were, even though there was a bad definition. And most of the estimates had no basis. They were simply experts who were saying, oh, there are tens of thousands of these cults in the US, but there wasn't any actual definitive research done to show that. So remember when we talked about warrants, it is connecting the social problem with beliefs that society already holds. And there were two main beliefs that society already held that these claimants were able to connect Satanism to. One was that there was a massive concern about, the progressive practices and policies from the 60s and the 70s, the rise of marijuana, of other drugs. Heavy metal was a big concern that people thought were evil. There was this concern that Christianity was waning. And so there was a lot of concerns about the direction that society was going, that then people claiming Satanism as a problem could say, this is why all of those terrible things were happening. The second was the value of children. If you've ever watched The Simpsons, the Reverend's wife will often go, think of the children, and this was a common refrain throughout this panic of, why aren't we doing anything about this? It's mostly affecting children. We need to think of the children. So there was this, they connected the satanic panic to the inherent value that children had in American and Western society, and that we should be doing something because of this. Now, the conclusions that were raised, there were a lot of arrests of people who were accused and even sentenced, like people who were sentenced. There was a lot of PSAs about prevention, how to notice whether or not your son or daughter is engaged in a cult. And then a lot of awareness trying to say this is how to notice a cult, or this is a problem. Here's how to spot it, right? Lippert concludes by this. So the construction of Satanism as a social problem in Canada has been made possible by various claims makers, particularly American experts and the Canadian news media. The efforts of these and other dominant claims makers can be seen as a symbolic crusade against perceived threats to their conservative ideology and way of life. An examination of Satanism suggests how influential news media and so-called experts are in constructing social problems. It also reveals how social problems can emerge, grow, and become legitimated quite apart from conditions of objective reality. Now remember, as we talked about a while ago, there are two elements to social problems. There's objective and subjective elements. The objective being the actual negative consequences for large numbers of people, and the subjective element that the perception that there is a problem and it needs to be addressed. What Lippert is saying here is that there doesn't even need to be the objective reality. As long as people believe that there is an objective reality, as long as there's the perception of a problem, then it is a social problem. And it will be real in its effects. Many people's lives were ruined during the Satanic Panic, who were arrested and put in jail for decades. Some people had their lives ruined or their businesses closed. And if you think about the kids who were kind of pressured into confessing that they were part of a Satanic Panic, that's going to affect them for a long time. So even though Satanism wasn't a real threat, it had real effects during the whole social problem that it was in place. So there are 4 possibilities if we're looking at whether it has an objective element and a subjective element of types of social problems. There's those that are, so on the left, you'll see that there's whether or not they're a subjective problem. On the top, you'll see whether or not they're an objective problem. So in the top left, we have problems that are both objectively real and also have a subjective perception. The AIDS epidemic is a good example where it was an objective problem both in the 80s and today that there is a widespread epidemic of AIDS. In the 80s, it was a contested subjective problem. What was the perception of the problem? There was a very conservative backlash to the AIDS epidemic who thought it was, if you look at protests from those times, you'll see signs that say AIDS is God's response to gays, or AIDS is gay cancer, etc. Whereas LGBT advocates were saying this is a epidemic that we need assistance from. They ended up being the ones who were correct. And so the AIDS epidemic is correctly identified as a social problem. On the bottom left, you have an objective problem and the absence of a subjective perception of a problem. One of those is the amount of sugar in U.S. foods. Objectively, that is one of the unhealthiest parts of American diets is the fact that we have sugar in our foods. And in fact, the sugar industry paid a lot of money for experts, for politicians to go after fat instead of sugar, arguing that fat was the thing that was causing a lot of problems in American diets. That's what the obesity epidemic was about, when in fact, the objective problem was actually sugar. So in this case, there was no social problem because there was any idea that, or any claim that sugar was the problem was clamped down and never really got to a widespread perception that anything had to be done about it. Now, when we look at objectivity, so on the right side, the top right is when there isn't an objective problem, but there is a perception of a problem. So these are still social problems, right? The Satanic Panic we just talked about as a social problem. the witches in the witch hunts in Salem, Massachusetts in like the 1700s, those were both perceived to be social problems, even though there wasn't a widespread satanic cabal, and there weren't really witches. But because people thought there were, it created a social problem. Now, on the bottom right, we have things that are neither an objective problem or a subjective problem. So I put down people who like pears more than oranges. Clearly, that's not a problem, and no one thinks it's a problem. So it's not a social problem. So we have to, based on what we've read from Lippert and the textbook, what really makes a social problem is whether or not the society perceives there to be a social problem. And in this case, that's both when there is objectively a problem, like the AIDS epidemic, and when there's not objectively a problem, like the Satanic Panic and witches in Salem, Massachusetts. And that's it. So let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to meet individually about this. But this will, throughout the rest of the course, this is what we're going to be talking about, is how there are a bunch of claims makers and claims about problems in society. We'll be doing this a lot. What are the claims maker? What are their claims? And do they match up to objective reality? Okay, we'll see you next week when we talk about a variety of technical and natural problems and how they actually have social causes. And we will see you then.